Good afternoon and welcome to Reboot 2030, the Democracy School's social media channel. My name is Nico Heller, and today I have as my guest Lene Rachel Andersen. Lene is an economist, a futurist, and a Bildung activist, and we'll be talking a lot more about that a little later on. Lene has written 19 books, among them Metamodernity in 2019 and Bildung, Keep Growing in 2020. She's won 2 democracy awards and is one of the founders of Nordic Bildung, a Copenhagen-based think tank. She's also a full member of the Club of Rome. Now, I see she's already in the waiting room, so let me just invite her in. And there she is. There she is.
Hello.
Hi.
Come on, everything.
Good afternoon. I've just said a few words about you, about your background. So let's jump straight in, Lene. I said you're an economist, a futurist, and a Bildung activist, but I haven't mentioned so far that you also were a leading comedy writer in a previous life, and that you've studied theology. So you've had a huge and a very long journey behind you, bring a wealth of experience to your work. Today, I think you're primarily here as a Bildung activist, but it crosses over into futurology, I believe, because some of the stuff you're talking about very much has to do with the kind of future that we would like to see. So, Lene, let me hand over to you, and maybe you just introduce yourself a little bit and say just something about your background and how you've come to become a Bildung activist. And then, of course, as we move on, we will be going into this idea, into this notion in greater detail. So over to you, Lene.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It is correct. I used to write comedy for television. I'm not a comedian, so I'm only funny on demand. And no, I don't do comedy. I wrote for some of the entertainment programs on Danish television, and I was not one of the head writers. But I had a lot of fun doing it. I learned a lot from it. And yes, I do have 3 professional backgrounds, and I actually use the combination in my work as a futurist, because the background as a business economist, of course, has taught me a lot about the way that our society works, the legislation, the economy, all that stuff that are sort of the machinery behind our society. Theology, I did not complete my studies, but I did pass the classical Greek exam and the Latin exam. I have not used it since. Once in a while, it's very useful to know the Greek letters, but that's about it. That has given me an understanding of the really deep roots of Western civilization. So coming from that perspective, I have the sense of where are things coming from, not so much how are they working right now, but where are they coming from? And what. But
when you say, sorry, let me just kind of like, when you say we were coming from, are you talking about as a historical we?
Sure, but also a moral and philosophical background, and who came up with these ideas and what was before it. And I think very often when we look at history, and I mean, in order to be able to extrapolate from now out into the future, we need to know, I mean, what went before, so that what is the trajectory somehow. And to see the big patterns in history, and what is it, when did technology turn everything upside down, and when was the last time we were like everything was up in the air and we needed to reboot. So theology has given me that. It was a Lutheran Protestant theology at the University of Copenhagen, so it has a very serious academic approach to theology. So it's not a preacher's seminary. It is an academic program. And from that, I knew the Bible. I mean, I knew the tradition, but I had not read the text in a context. I had not had the historical context for it. And as I said, I mean, when we want to look at history, we have a tendency to look at history from our perspective, and then we look back at the Greek and say, oh, how barbarian that they had slaves in the Greek society. It was barbarian. But when you look at what came before that, the Greek society was very civilized in a modern sense and had made huge progress for, democracy, freedom for the men, yes, but it was better than the tyranny that went before it. And then when you look at the the Torah, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and then you look at the life world of the Jews in the Bronze Age, and you look back and say, wow, looking from our perspective, what primitive people. But then when you look at it and come into history from the other direction, it's like, oh, wow, they came up with that. I never thought that this was a thing that somebody, really was the big groundbreaking new idea. So that is what I got from that. And then the comedy writing told me something about, telling stories, getting people to laugh, but also, so what is story structure? And it's sort of a backdoor to our structuring and understanding of reality, because when you tell a story and you want people to listen, there's structure to it. So it says something about how is our mind working. So those three different perspectives on the reality that we're living in and the challenges that we're facing has been very useful for me. And then the first series of books that I wrote was big history, and so I had to, on my own, go back even further than the theology class curriculum. So I, based on that and on science and chaos theory, network theory, complexity theory, and other sort of descriptions of the patterns according to which things tend to evolve. I have looked at history, and based on that, I do futurism.
There is something
I try to create scenarios that are meaningful and ways of looking at the world that allows us to see things that we didn't see before.
There's something interesting. I just want to come back to the comedy, because there's something quite intriguing about this. If you do any kind of fictional drama or whatever, you don't really have to be interested in the real world. I mean, because you're not a documentary filmmaker, it's fiction and it's fun and it's a parallel world. With comedy, it's somewhat different, isn't it? I mean, I noticed this when I moved to the UK. It took me a long time to understand the jokes, being German, and vice versa. Having moved back to Germany, I had to acclimatize to the German sense of humor. So there's an interesting thing. It's once you understand the humor of a people or the humor of a culture, you have understood a lot about that culture. And so when you are a comedy writer, you not only tell a story, but it is a story that resonates with. Right.
Plus, either it's funny or it's not. You can write mediocre drama and you can have great actors who go in and lift the whole thing, and you think that you've watched an amazing piece. If you write crappy humor, you can have, the best comedians, and it's just, drops to the floor and nothing happens. So either you hit the real spot or it doesn't work.
But there's an interesting kind of link for me in your work. It's a sort of a link between the fictional, the imaginary, our imagination on the one hand, but it's very much grounded in cultural reality. And I think this is something that when we talk about, later on when we talk about Bildung, and part of its purpose to give us a better understanding of the world we live within. I see a certain parallel there. Bildung can be quite ivory tower and removed, but you seem to have a very strong interest in always keeping those two worlds together, the world of the imaginary and the world of the factual and empirical. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And I also, humor, you can have very sort of highbrow humor that only like a minute minority gets, and then you can have the extremely popular humor that usually has sexual undertones or worse, and anything there in between, and you need to reach your audience in the right way.
That's right.
And one thing that is very crucial in humor that very few people think about is that pain is really a huge part of it, and it's about triggering our fear but doing it in a safe way. And there's some interesting studies with mice where they're tickled, so they laugh, and you can actually Google laughing mice and go on YouTube and write laughing mice or something like that, and you will see some scientists tickling some mice, and then they go squeaky, and it's interpreted as laughter. And the reason why it's interpreted as laughter is because they come back for more. So when they stop tickling them, they come back. So it's this fear, it creates a fear, but in a safe way. And you do the same thing with humor. I mean, the classical way of telling a story is that you have like three characters, the priest, the rabbi, and the pastor or something like that, and they walk into a bar, and then the first one goes something, the second one goes something, and then the third one is the punchline. And the reason why it works is that the first one is an example, the second one confirms the first one. Now you feel safe, and then you dismantle it with the third example, and you're like up in the air. It's a bit, frightening until you realize what the point is, and then you laugh because it wasn't frightening at all. So it's that tension between fear and safety somehow, and oh, I get it, and then you laugh. And this is also why it doesn't work if you explain a joke, because then you just lost it. So
there was another thing I picked up when I was doing a little bit of reading up on you, is that one of the reasons you're sort of saying that you moved on from comedy writing to futurology and the work you're doing today is that comedy, for some reason, and you probably can say more about this, lends itself to sort of bashing the past or, looking back. But it's a lot more difficult to write comedy about the future, or to criticize so maybe I thought that was a really, really interesting thought after the fact and anticipating. Can you say a little bit more about that and the
Yes, I mean, particularly satire is, pointing fingers at. And when you point fingers at, you can kick up and you can kick down, or you can kick out into your, own level, or you can, make fun of yourself, which is really the only charming kind of humor there is. And particularly the kicking down kind of humor is not charming. The kicking up humor, where you mock the rulers or people in power or people with too much money, is absolutely appropriate and in place, but it's not necessarily going to solve a lot of problems. But it can be this, release of tension in society, and it can be showing solidarity with, among all the little guys, those of us who are in the precariat or, have nothing, or are in the, middle class, seeing that the bottom is falling out of the economy. I mean, everybody who is, not Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, we need to laugh at them, where we used to laugh at the rulers and,
the kings and queens and yeah.
And also, corrupt politicians, prime ministers, and so forth. And there are a couple of authoritarian political leaders around the world that we deserve to laugh at.
But there came the point when that wasn't enough for you anymore, when you were kind of reaching beyond that. And can you tell us a little bit about that transition?
Yeah. So, what I realized was, actually with entertainment on television, I realized that the Saturday or Friday evening family entertainment, I was actually doing children's programming that adults could, watch, because you want to reach the 8-year-olds so that they stay in front of the screen and then their parents sit there with them. So if you're one of the parents who spend your Friday evening, Saturday evening watching family entertainment with your 8-year-olds, you should just realize that you're actually being treated like an 8-year-old by other adults who are creating shows that your children can comprehend, and you're not spending your time dealing with the future and all the important stuff that is here in the world. You need to spend time with your children, but you might want to spend them on other stuff than children programming for the entire family. That was just sort of a footnote to what I'm going to say, which is the satire, the humor can deconstruct, and it can point fingers. It can be a sort of a safety vault, letting steam out, and it can deal with pain that you cannot deal with in any other ways. It can deal with frustration, but it's not solving any problems. So I felt the need for solving some problems and starting these conversations among adults that get us safely into the future and help us create a future worth living in. And humor just was not the tool.
It's just not very funny. Some of the future is just not even worth making fun of.
I mean, it's absolutely worth making fun of, but it's not taking us anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's just saying this does not work, but it doesn't say when this doesn't work, where should we go? And I want to do the when this is not enough, where should we go? Where should we go as a society, as families, as individuals, as citizens? And so we have to have those conversations. As one of them, we're starting that right now. So I realized that humor was not the platform. I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot from it. I think it's really important. But I had served my part of that part of the media landscape and needed to move on to something else.
And then the other really interesting aspect about you is, and that's just amazingly impressive, you have written at this stage, I believe, I hope I don't forget it, but I think 19 books.
Yes.
I mean, most people are happy if they write like 2 or 3 books in their lifetime, and you've done this more or less in the last, not even 20 years, 15 years, I suppose. Or that's a huge output. But you have invested significantly more sort of emotional energy in this notion of Bildung, because you also set up an institute or a think tank, Nordic Bildung, and you are campaigning around that issue, maybe in the way you haven't campaigned around other issues in the past. But you might have. I don't want to sort of jump the gun here, but it to me appears that this is something that's, that you've stumbled across something that really does matter to you in a big way. Do you want to kind of tell us a little bit about what that actually is? Because I think anybody listening is probably at this point thinking, well, what are they talking about? Yes. So let's get into a little bit into the substance of it, this idea of a Bildung Rose. And you said in our preliminary chat that you wanted to kind of move towards this slowly. So you wanted to start off with some definitions beforehand. Let's go straight into this. The word Bildung means a lot to me. I'm German, it's a German word. Anybody who is not German will think, well, is this a spelling mistake?
Yes.
So maybe we start there.
So Bildung comes from the German word Bild, which means image. And originally the image was the image of Christ when we're back in the 1600s. And then with the Enlightenment, it kind of sort of left the vocabulary, and people were not so much into shaping themselves and their personal character in the image of Christ. Instead, from around 1770-ish and onwards, it became a secular phenomenon where philosophers were dealing with, so how do I shape myself in my own self-image? How do I become entirely me? How do I become an autonomous individual? How do I become how do I become a team player, and how do I become an autonomous individual? How do I become somebody that other people trust? And how do I become a moral person who can take a moral stand and has a moral backbone? Let
me just ask a question here. Why is that important to become you? Why has it become important during that period of enlightenment? What is the kind of the background to that? Why is it all about self-realization and building an ego, or what is the context here?
It had a sort of a prelude with the philosopher Herder, who was writing about how culture and individuals had matured over the course of history. And he, living in the 1770s, he did not know how old the world actually was. So they took the Bible as more or less for granted, even though there were signs that the world may have been older than that. And there were some fossils that they had found that they didn't really make sense yet, because Darwin hadn't, discovered what Darwin discovered. So they were really where did the world come from, and where did humans come from, and how did we get to where we are? And so, very politically incorrect, he talked about the upbringing or the Bildung of humans and the human species. And so he compared the cultural evolution to the maturing of the individual. And he started by saying that, so these Middle Eastern nomadic tribes, they were like the toddler. And then you had the Phoenicians, who were like a little bit older child. And then you had the Greek, who were an early sort of like a 7-10-year-old, and then you had the Romans, who were the teenagers, and then you had the Christians, who were the young adults, but of course they were Catholic and he was a Protestant. So the real adults would be the Protestants, which was what he was. And so he compared that development. And I mean, there is something to it, but you can't compare people 5,000 years ago to a modern toddler. I mean, that, of course you can't. But the sense that our understanding of the world, our ability, how societies allow individual autonomy has, of course, changed over the course of history. And with bigger and bigger societies, we've also distributed power and individual responsibility to people, because otherwise rulers would have to apply extreme amounts of violence if you want, 100,000 people in a ring-walled city to play by the same rules. You either have to use a lot of violence, or you have to invent stories that they all internalize so that they behave in the same ways and have more or less the same expectations, moral values, so that you can have trust within the ring-walled city. Then, of course, you need enemies in order to keep that story going, and that's where we get into the trouble. And we have that with nationalism or national chauvinism in the modern world. But we still have to have within a society some level of shared narratives, language, and what Herder then called spirit. And that's when we get into this whole idea of, so what is this upbringing process that brings us to sharing that spirit, to have that shared sense of self and collective self, to have that sense of belonging in a huge society. And what happened in the 1700s, late 1700s, was that the Enlightenment was, as I said, I mean, with the fossils and all that stuff going on, new knowledge about the world, a lot of the old stories were up in the air, and they were struggling with, how do we deal with this? And of course, he and Goethe and Schiller and Fichte and Hegel and all these guys who were gathered in Jena in one of the German states were exploring this among themselves in the bourgeoisie. So they were really just thinking about Bildung and shaping yourself in your personal image and, unfolding your personality and becoming all that you can be, as I guess the American army would say, that was just for themselves in the bourgeoisie. They were not thinking about the peasants and the workers, but the notion that you go through an emotional and moral development from not just in childhood. That was, Rousseau described that in 1762, which was really a Copernican turnaround of European thinking. And what Rousseau contributed with was the notion that emotions matter. And the emotional development was what he was describing in this book named Emile from 1762. And all these German thinkers read Rousseau, and so did the Swiss pedagogue Pestalozzi, and he was also writing about Bildung. So Bildung is a combination of your moral and emotional development and what we usually call education. And really, education should include the Bildung and the moral and emotional development. But when we talk about education, particularly in the aftermath of the invention of the PISA test, we think of education increasingly as what can be measured, the knowledge that we can transfer from one person to the next. And it doesn't just have
the PISA test. I mean, I think a lot of people in education, of course, know it, and we do see the kind of the league tables every so often, and people go, oh God, we've kind of fallen back a place. But you very briefly say what it is and what it measures, so that we have a.
I mean, the PISA test is has been developed by the OECD, and by the way, it's kind of strange that we call ourselves a civilization, and it's not the pedagogues and the teachers who have developed the measurement for good education. It's the economists. I mean, there's something wrong here. So anyway, this economic organization for a certain kind of industrialized societies have made a test for, I think it's like all the 15-year-olds in all these nation states. And once every 5 years, they measure reading skills, math skills, basic knowledge in geography. But I think they also measure now whether people can, I guess, go online and book a train ticket, some practical stuff. But still, all of this knowledge that has been transferred in this way can be measured. And so, I mean, if I try to teach you math, we can work on it. And then after 2 weeks, I can test how much of this can you do on your own. And we can do it with grammar. We can do it with, knowledge. We can do it with biology. And I can test how much, got stuck and how much of it you can, answer the right questions. But that is only part of what education should be. By the way, education in that respect is also, practical learning and transfer of knowledge, like how to bake a bread or fix a bicycle, or the traffic rules for that matter. It's not just what happens in school when we talk about knowledge transfer. But then there's the other part of Bildung, which is the knowledge that you cannot transfer, which is, so how do you handle yourself if you need to play a game and you have to play by the rules for the first time when you're a 5-year-old? And if you can't figure out how to play by the rules, the other kids are not going to play with you anymore. And that kind of learning is not something we can transfer, but I can send the 5-year-old out and to play with the other kids again and again until he or she knows how to play by the rules and suddenly gets new friends. And then hopefully the child will learn, okay, so if I'm a good pal, I have friends tomorrow. And if I have friends tomorrow, we can do other fun stuff. And later, you learn to stand in line and keep your place in the line. You suffer a heartbreak and you come over that, and you start a family, you go to your first job interview, say something really stupid, and you learn that I shouldn't have said that. So all this stuff, and how you handle yourself, is the emotional and moral development. And we cannot, I cannot test if you actually got it. I can tell you about my experiences, but I cannot transfer them. And if you go through an experience like mine, I cannot test what that did to you. We can have a conversation about it. And if we spend enough time together, I can sense, and you can sense on me, okay, so is this a person who is has the moral and emotional development that I would expect for that person's age? Is it somebody who's worth hanging out with? But we can't make a test for that. I won't, say that nobody's trying, but it is going to be a disaster if we actually try to test this. Because what would it mean to score 8 on friendship ability? That would just be horrible.
There's, I suppose, another aspect is what one is the kind of the soft skills, the hard to quantify ones, and those are, you've just talked about those. But there's another thing, and it's sort of, as far as I know, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but when in art education, specifically in fine art, when you go to like an academy and you study fine art, from a certain level on, certainly at a master's level, there are a lot of academies that do not award grades, because the whole notion of fine art education is about student-centric learning. So as an artist, you set your own learning goals, and you design together with your supervisor and your teacher a learning path that allows you to realize and to progress along that path. Now, how can you compare that path with that path? They're kind of entirely different. You have to, in a way, assess people on their own terms. And so this is another aspect. It's when learning isn't about competition, but when learning is about development, the grading, the kind of quantification of he's this good compared to her who's only that good, it kind of moves in the background. And of course, there are other areas where it's not quite so clear. In fine art, you're still producing a product, and people will still have an opinion on this. But there's other aspects, as you said, to do with character development, where it's even more difficult, because again, to some extent, and that's kind of Dewey's kind of like notion, isn't it, is, to some extent through experiential learning, it's very much about developing on your own terms, within a moral framework, presumably, but still very much on your own terms.
But there's a fundamental difference between the arts and the sciences, for instance, because in the sciences, you want people to know their math, and you want them to know the method. That's right. And you want them, you want scientists to get the right kind of answers in the right way through the right process.
That's right.
So here you have to, it actually makes sense to measure and test before we let this physicist work on the next, nanotechnology or nuclear power plant.
That's right.
Do they know their math? It's worth testing. I'm all for it. But then when you have somebody who plays the violin, and plus, I want all the physicists to know the same kind of math But I also want them to be, I mean, think individually. They have to be able to challenge each other. But I mean, they have to be exact in what they're doing. And then when you have the violinist, then it is all about their personality and their emotional range, and how can they express that emotional range through an instrument. And you can only get to that by, you know, getting in touch with your emotions and learning to play. I mean, in order for it to be not just reproduction of whatever is on the sheets, you have to, you know, really know the instrument. You have to be one with the instrument. And then you express what you have inside yourself through the melody and the rhythm and everything that was in the sheet of music. So you go, I mean, you listen to music because it moves you. You listen to music because it touches something inside you. And it is the other human being that you want to feel when you listen to that music. And you both want to listen to the violinist and say Mozart, who wrote the music. So there's this whole, I mean, human experience that, you know, can lift us up and or get us down or get us excited and all that stuff. And that is where particularly Schiller is interesting in his concept of Bildung, because he says that personal development, he talks about three different kinds of people. The person who's caught in his or her emotions and therefore is not free because the emotions define everything. And the second kind of person who has transcended the emotions by internalizing the norms of society, and therefore is not free either, because the expectations of other people are defining what I'm doing, what I find right, and what I'm choosing to do. So they're not free either. The only free and moral person is the person who's then transcended the what he calls it the person of reason, the person who follows the rationale of society, the person who has transcended those expectations and can make up his or her own mind and feel his own emotions and knows what is best for society and what works in society, and can then combine it in his or her own way. And that is the person with Bildung, but the process is also Bildung. And what Schiller says is that from being in the throes of your emotions and to becoming the person of reason, aesthetics, the calming beauty, can sort of align your emotions with the emotions of others. And once you have been brought into that, then you are, in a modern term, a team player. And we need team players. We need to go through this process, which is also why it's so interesting that teenagers who are, in this process of becoming team players in society and within their family, I guess everybody who's had teenage children knows how hard this can be, but they identify very often with a certain kind of music that shapes their sense of group belonging. And through that, they become socialized into one subculture with a certain kind of norms. And through that experience, we can then, see, okay, so here's this person who is into rap music or punk music or grunge or whatever it is. Once they belong to that subculture, they've been socialized into something. Now they can take that experience and also later become conscientious citizens. And then, you learn what it means to be an adult in our society. You play by the rules, you've internalized them. You can be trusted by other adults, you get good jobs and you buy a house, and then your wife leaves you or the husband runs away with somebody else. And it's like, everything that I worked for collapsed. What am I going to do now? And that is when you can sort of break out of this prison of the expectations of others and find out, so who am I? But Schiller says there's also another way of doing it, which is that we can have the aesthetics, the beauty that wakes us up and shakes us up so that we can feel our emotions again and transcend this, rationale of society and feel our own emotions again.
So what you're
the aesthetics and the personal development go together, and that is, and this is a Bildung process. So this Bildung thing is a really multifaceted, rich, complex phenomenon. And I think
if I understand you correctly, what you're sort of saying is there's different. And I'm introducing one of your terms here. So that there's different domains, if you like, in the kind of learning experience, and each domain, in a way, demands its own sort of learning style, and also, of course, has its own learning objectives. And they're not just somewhat different on a spectrum, but they're fundamentally different. They're qualitatively different. As you said earlier, if I study physics, then yes, I want to be tested. But if I study fine art, then I want to be measured against my own development. And these are two very fundamentally different styles. So I think this leads on to the next idea, which is, I think, something that's really worth talking about at length, and that's your Bildung Rose Model. Maybe you can sort of dive into this and
Yes.
yeah.
And the smart viewer has noticed that I have this really advanced piece of AV equipment on the wall behind me, because I was told I couldn't bring any slides, but I insisted that I could do a drawing.
That's right. You outwitted me.
So we're going to do that now. And yes, I have created a model that is called the Bildung Rose. And what it describes is, I would say, any functioning society through 7 domains. And the one domain that, and all societies have these domains. One is production.
It's great. I can read it really well. It's good.
Excellent.
Yeah,
I will do this more often. Okay, so another domain in society is technology. And then there is a domain of the aesthetics. And then there is power. All societies have this. And there is a domain of factual knowledge. But in the modern world, we have a whole sector who takes care of this, and that is science. So it's a process of creating a certain kind of knowledge, and it's the kind of knowledge that has been tested and tested and tested until nobody could prove it wrong anymore, and then becomes a scientific theory. So this is science. My colleague is not going to be happy if I start writing out here. And then we have narrative in all societies. And narrative can be religion. It can be the history about who is our people, who is our country, where are we coming from. But it can also be political ideology. So this is really about the stories that we keep telling in order to tell ourselves who we are and who's a good person. We have it in the modern world also in some of the archetypical stories, like in James Bond, for instance. I mean, it's basically a Messiah story, but it's in a modern dress. And we keep telling these stories over and over again. And that's why, when you go to the movie theater, who is the villain and who is the good guy and who will survive. Then you get into postmodernism, we deconstruct everything and the bad guys win. But until then, the narrative was telling us who's the good guy and how do you, and this is also where the Bildung comes in, how do you shape yourself in this image? Who would I like to be between James Bond and Blofeld and, Miss Moneypenny? I'm trying to find out. And then the last one is ethics. And the way that I distinguish between moral values and ethics is that moral values are the guiding principles in familiar situations. And it is what we have embedded in our narrative. Ethics are the principles that guide us in unfamiliar situations. It's sort of underneath the moral values. And so when we have unfamiliar situations, like when new technologies are disrupting everything, we can't go to our moral values anymore because they don't suffice. So you have social media. Can you share a nude picture of your ex when it was on paper and it took, hours to sit in the dark chamber and, expose these pictures? Yes, you could share your one nasty people just to mock your ex. It wasn't nice, but it was not a catastrophe. That doesn't work anymore. So we need ethics, because the moral values cannot guide us, but the ethics tell us that we're in a completely new situation. What are the principles behind not sharing a nude picture of your ex? Well, it's that the this is just not, the dignity of that person is more important than me having this, little kick out of making him or her look ridiculous. So we need to go to the ethics and figure out, so what was the principle behind the idea that you couldn't do this or that, because in a new situation, we have to do it in a different way. And so the reason why it's called a rose is because it's like little flower with petals in it. And I'm really going to try not to hit the wall here. So that would be the Bildung Rose. And with growing societies, I usually, illustrate them as arrows. When society grows, these domains have to grow as well in complexity, in expertise. And the way that the rose is constructed is that those domains that are neighboring collaborate really easily. In production and aesthetics, you have industrial design, for instance, but you also have the whole advertising industry. So, there's a lot of collaboration between production and aesthetics. You also have a narrative and aesthetics, where you have religion using the most, fantastic aesthetics available of the time in order to get people, to come to temple and pray and have that transcendent experience that the arts can provide. And then you have, of course, the ethics. Science also has ethics, but it's different ethics than you have in the moral values. But the ethics that define the process in science is what makes it science. It isn't just about looking out the window and saying, oh, is it raining or is it not raining? It is about saying, okay, we have a process for a hypothesis saying, I guess it's raining. I look out the window, water is coming down. I had my hypothesis confirmed, and now I have knowledge. And then I can have it peer reviewed. I can check it with my, friends. Is this enough water for it to be rain, or is it just fog? And then we can discuss that, and somebody will, send back the peer review and say, Lene, that is not rain at all. It's just fog. So, so that is the ethics behind science. And then, of course, and so the reason why it's called the Bildung Rose and not the societal rose is that in order for us to thrive in society, we need to know some of all of this. Our inner world needs to grasp the outer world, and particularly when we are voting in order to find the right politicians, we need to understand some of all of this, and we need to elect people who also understand some of all of this. And we also need, as professionals, not to be, completely absorbed by, the one thing into which we have specialized ourselves. We need to know some of all of it, because we need to be able to communicate what it is we do with other people who come from a different background. We also need to be citizens who can bring that with which we are, in a unique position to contribute to society into that society. So here you produce new knowledge, but you also produce new knowledge in aesthetics, but it's a different kind of knowledge. It's a new symbolic world. And so if we take the music and the, really, avant-garde musician, for instance, they know all the, the catalog, they know how to play the classics. And then they reach the boundary of what this culture is capable of explaining with music. And then you push the envelope. You push the boundary of what is this genre of music capable of doing. And then 100 years ago, they had jazz. 70 years ago, they had Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And now, 20 years ago, it was like house and rap music. And now it's a completely different kind of music with a lot of auto-tune, and it's becoming more and more electronic, even the human voice. And there are so many genres. You can't just say there's like one thing. So each of these domains, we need to understand some of all of them in order to not, be, confused when we go out into our own culture and in order to make informed decisions.
I had a sort of a kind of, if you like, sort of two political narratives in the back of my mind, which you can quite nicely project onto your model, and it conjures, it brings up very, very different societies, if you like. And of course, you know, as a voter, as a citizen, I will be voting on this proposal or on that. And the one proposal, you can call it the American dream, from the dishwasher to the millionaire. It's meritocracy, and it's a race to the top.
Over here.
That's right, and there's something about this is like, I think that the ethical version of this means, for as long as you're a good sport, for as long as you participate, there is always charity to kind of to cushion the fall if you don't make it to the top, or not even to a point where you can sustain an existence. So that is a sort of the kind of, you know, dishwasher to millionaire, you know, at least I tried. If I haven't succeeded, at least I tried. There's another model, which is leave no one behind. It's kind of the opposite, isn't it? It's like, it's a social welfare model where you sort of say, well, you know, the weakest link in the chain is what we need to base our, you know, our policies on, so that nobody falls through the cracks. And of course, if you take those two, leave no one behind on the one hand, and the American dream, you know, from dishwasher to millionaire on the other, both have their mythology, of course, and both have their supporters, but they mean very different things. And if you operationalize it across your Bildung Rose, you get very, very different systems of knowledge. Now, just sort of on from there, if you were to sort of superimpose your Bildung Rose model on existing curricula, on existing school structures, you know what people learn in school, my sense is, and maybe we can go through this very briefly, you know, my sense is that it will show how far removed we are from this kind of political approach, because what we learn in school is very clustered in some areas, and it's like,
we're really upgrading everybody's skills for this, and we're willing to we're willing to pay for science if it is useful here. We have even handed over our political system to the market and say, oh, the market can fix it. So government, parliaments, political institutions have said that we forget about all of this stuff, the narrative and the ethics and discussion about which kind of model is it that we want. We just let everything up here decide everything because the market can allocate resources. And then we forgot all of this. And actually, I want to add a layer to this model, which is that if you kind of draw lines here, you can say this is what is possible here and now. So this is like is. And we just go for more of everything, faster and, you know, more efficient. And this is also where, this is literally where the money is made. Here is where we explore what could things be like, what might be. And so here it's the symbolic world and political power. It's, you know, political choices and scenarios. And in science, it's like, oh, wow, what if we try and turn it this way? Or what would happen if we did like this? Or, you know, creating new kind of knowledge. So this is in might be.
But it's interesting.
Like what ought to be.
What ought to be.
And the ought is a conversation that we've almost given up on in our society, which is disastrous, because the tech industry is turning everything upside down, and we have just, you know, forgot that we could have a moral compass. And when we talk about education, that's why I think this model and Bildung Rose is so crucial. When we look at education, we need, for all the different educational programs from, you know, kindergarten to PhD, to make sure that everybody struggles with all of it.
It's very interesting. There's an aspect about this middle layer. For a moment, I was kind of thinking, well, should aesthetics be at in that middle layer? But of course, it needs to be, because it is the form-giving element. You know, in design, you're talking about two aspects. You're talking about form and function, and the aesthetics is very much the sort of the kind of the formal side of it, and the science, in many ways, the function. How does it work? How do we, you know, how does the engine work? And then, of course, the aesthetics is what does it look like? What does it sound like? And of course, with car engines, I was amazed to find out at some point the amount of money that's spent on making those engines sound good.
Or just, I mean, the sound of the door, car door when it shuts.
That's right.
It's a whole, tech science production, field of car door sound engineers.
That's right. So it's very interesting the way you structure this. Now, of course, in a way, it gives us a compass, doesn't it? How education could move from quite a narrow understanding of education today to a more, a broader understanding, a more grounded, a holistic understanding of what education could and indeed should probably be. Are you working on this on your own, or how? I mean, this is such a big idea, and so of course, if we want to move towards some kind of implementation, then we need partners, don't we? So how are you taking this forward?
I mean, I'm doing it in talks like this. I'm writing some papers about it. We have an article about it on our website. There are some slides. We can share a link to a book that I wrote recently that is called "What is Bildung?" The model is in there. There are also links to some slides that you can use yourself. I have not put all the slides there because I have some of them that I use when I go out and do the lectures. But the basic idea is mine. I've been working on it since 2005, and it has, it took a while before I realized that this petal here is called aesthetics. It had a number of names, and I called it art, and it was like, no, that is too limiting, because we also have, pop music and singing in the family and all that kind
and car doors. I mean, you said it. There's nothing artistic about it, but it's very much. That's right.
So I mean, it took a while, and it also, I mean, I actually started out just focusing on production, science, and narrative. I mean, those were the three domains and power that I was aware of to begin with, that all societies have, and that was when I was writing my first books and was looking at big history, and I was like, what is it what was it that changed over the course of history, and is there a way to describe, and so what I realized was that what happened during the Renaissance was that science and power pulled themselves away from narrative, first the science pulled away from religion, and then political power pulled away from religion, and then religion was stuck with what? Narrative. And then I also felt that there must be something between where that narrative and production share, and that was the one that I couldn't figure out, but I definitely very quickly found out that what science and production share is the development of technology.
Absolutely.
And the common denominator between narrative and science is ethics. It's process and principles. Absolutely. So that was how it started, and so if we use it as a picture of modernity, it is really, the more that these domains have separated and specialized, the more complex society is, the more complex education has to be, the longer we have to go to school, and the more complex each of the domains become, and the more they specialize, and the harder they have to communicate with the other domains, which is one of the problems also. I mean, how many engineers know the cultural heritage that we come from, and the roots of the moral values that we have and that keep our societies together? And how many of the artists could actually take some of the latest science and turn it into new symbols that would make sense to us in a different way? There are artists that do that. I met some of them. They're really great. But we need way more collaboration across the rows, so to speak. And one of the jobs of the political power then is to balance these and make sure that all of the money that is made up here gets channeled out into the rest, because we cannot have a balanced and functioning society if all the resources are up here.
But also power, to me, to some extent, seems to be, if you like, a function of those six petals. So I think there is a sort of a kind of, if you would want to sort of manifest or somehow show how your kind of system empowers, you know, it would be sort of an integration of those 6 petals, and power would emerge at the center, not power over, but they're very much a sort of Habermasian power to. And that's very interesting. Now, last thing I would like to kind of sort of like touch on during this talk, and this is the relevance of this model in today's world. You know, there is, you know, for the lack of a better word, sort of an emergence of sort of an an anti-enlightenment, and of course also anti-establishment, but very much an anti-enlightenment kind of movement that basically does no longer accept science as truth and wants to have its own truths, its own, you know, fictional or fake narrative. So it's conspiracy theories or whatever you would want to call it. And I can only speculate, but one thought that crossed my mind is when that kind of sort of integrated body of knowledge that is sort of symbolized through the Bildung Rose, when that disintegrates, fragments, then you could well get a society that looks a bit like what we have today. Is that a sort of a fair enough?
Absolutely. And I mean, what we have done over the past generation, I mean, there are 2 movements here. One is that the complexity of everything is so mind-boggling that it's just hard to handle. And it's hard to handle for all of us. This model actually helps you to break it down into 7 different domains, and you can look at them separately, which I hope is one step towards, you know, a little bit of peace of mind. But if we have an educational system that just focuses on this, and where science education is not about learning the process and not exactly knowing what people actually do at universities and what does make somebody a professor. I mean, I went to school for 12 years, through high school, until I realized, oh, that is what science is. I mean, they could have told me in the 3rd grade that when you have biology, the reason why we know this thing about the ants and this thing about the bees is that there are all these adults who use this method. And if they had repeated that once a year until the end of high school, I would have known the scientific process, you know, by heart. So, but we don't teach that. I mean, we just teach the result and, you know, tell the children about the bees and the ants and the sun and all this stuff. And it's like, we hope that they will remember the result, instead of teaching the ethics and the process. So if we taught that better, we would all be better off for a lot of reasons. But then when you have all this technology that disrupts, you lose your job, you can't follow the news on TV. I mean, there's all that stuff that's just too complicated for me to understand and too complex. I have these narratives about who I am and what is my role in the family, what is my role in my local community, and who are these people and these people and these people to tell me that there is this virus that I haven't caught yet that will have all these, you know, horrible consequences. And particularly if these people have not, you know, created this, I mean, turned this into language and symbols that I resonate with. And actually the concept of resonance and the arts is, I mean, a whole chapter in its own. But if I don't resonate with what is being said in all of these domains, and if I only feel anxiety and fear and something that I cannot grasp, it makes total sense that people go for, there's something comforting about conspiracy theories, because one of the crucial points of a conspiracy theory is that somebody is behind this.
Oh, yes.
And if
absolutely.
somebody isn't behind this, somebody is in control. But if nobody is behind this, nobody is in control. And that is freaking scary. So if these people are not in control, if these people are not in control, and these people are not in control either, it is actually more comforting to tell a story about somebody being in control. And it can be Hillary Clinton in a pizza parlor, or it can be the Jews, or it can be aliens, or it can be, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. But it feels good.
That's right. I have a cognitive. I was once, many years ago in London, I was mugged, and I had a gun between my eyes. And what really freaked me out is he was shaking. And I just thought, Jesus, if you put a gun at people, at least be cool about it. I know, but, you know, that really freaked me. That was much more, if you know, than anything else. That he wasn't in control.
Wow.
And that's now the other thing is, so that's a real interesting aspect. The other thing, of course, is that every one of those domains, of course, also can be corrupted to some extent. I mean, the very obvious one that came to mind is the commodification of art, which very often becomes production, rather than really kind of doing justice to the kind of the creative mandate and the kind of the sort of aesthetic mandate. It becomes production, and it's basically supplying product to the art market. But of course, when you think about this, of course, science also can become corrupted, and so in fact, can every single aspect of this.
They can all be corrupted. I mean, production can be all about exploitation. I mean, yes, that's why we have the climate crisis. That's why we have pollution. That's why we have, you know, slavery. There's 40 million people in slavery as we speak.
Yeah.
Tech can be corrupted and, you know, cause disruption
and surveillance and so forth and so forth. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. You're going to have narrative that can become fundamentalism and
fake news,
narrow-mindedness and stupidity, and you can have ethics that is too advanced for people to grasp. You can take the whole woke movement, which actually makes a lot of good points, but it has also become a fanatic movement of cancel culture. So what they're saying is actually, I mean, a lot of it is wonderful, but anything wonderful that does not allow for something non-wonderful to exist as well is going to be problematic, no matter how wonderful it is. So, I mean, if you have ethics that is too advanced for people to grasp, and you then apply, you know, intolerance in order to implement it, then ethics is just as problematic as any of the other ones. And of course, science can become incredibly arrogant, and you got all these scientists who just discuss among themselves. And if the rest of us don't understand what they're saying, it's like our problem because we didn't pay attention in school.
One last question before we wrap up. Are you working with any schools directly to with this methodology? Wouldn't that, or if not, would that not be something interesting to do?
I would love that. I mean, the think tank Nordic Bildung is 3 years old, or 3.5 by now. We started in March 2018, and we were on the wonderful trajectory of reaching out in the beginning of 2020, and then came COVID, and we went online like everybody else. And instead of, you know, finding institutions and applying this model together with them, we actually created a European Bildung network, which you can find online. There is also a North American Bildung network and a Latin American Bildung network and a global Bildung network. Wow. Where we bring people together to explore Bildung. And a lot of people are very enthusiastic about this model, like I am. And so we're having conversations about this, and we have online events, and we also have real live events, and of course more of them as COVID is at some point, you know, being handled. But so we're working on that, but we have, I mean, we survived the COVID, able to pay rent and keep our office, and that was like, yay! Yay!
Absolutely. No, this has been a traumatic time for all of us. It's been, and looking at the numbers in Germany at the moment, we're far from, you know, through it. So it's a terrible situation for a lot of us. And of course, Reboot 2030 is another one of those solutions to try to kind of keep the dialogue going, because what else can we do? What I would like to do, Lene, is to think about, you know, to carry on this conversation into the future, and to think about another get-together, virtual, presumably in about 6 months' time. And there's two things that kind of are in mind. One is I would like to, and probably that's the one in 6 months' time. I have a good understanding now what your understanding of Bildung is, and what the Bildung Rose model is. I would like to talk a lot more about application. Because I think that is really where a lot of the excitement lies, is when you talk about how this could actually transform sort of like educational systems.
Could transform education, but it could also transform organizations. I mean, this is really
that's right.
prism through which to see any group of people and how, I mean, what are we focusing on? Are we doing the right things in all of these 7 domains?
That's right. I mean, why shouldn't a political party be structured along those lines? Wouldn't that make sense?
Do we have political agendas on all of them? And do we know what we're talking about? And particularly, I mean.
That's right. So this is one thing. So I think maybe our next talk will be very much about application, and then hopefully that we're moving at that start, beginning to move beyond, pandemic restrictions. It would be nice then beyond that, maybe to focus on a couple of cases where you actually are going into organizations so that we can talk about.
That'd be great fun.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to do it. So we have another one in about 6 months' time, talk about application not in an abstract, but in a remote way, without actually going into organizations. And then maybe, hopefully, in 8 to 12 months, we will be able to kind of return to some kind of normal, certainly where we can have more social contact and explore activities outside our own 4 walls. Lene, thank you very much. One last thing, what I will do, if you could send me a list of useful links. You've mentioned a couple of things that you think would be really good. Also your contact details, if there are people listening in who would want to kind of, work with you as a consultant. So give us all that stuff. I will then post it alongside, included with this video, both on YouTube and on the reboot.2030.org website, and hopefully something will come from that. Lene, thank you very, very much. This has been a great talk. I really like the way you outwitted me with this kind of wall thing, because of course I did say to you, no, please don't.
This more often. It actually works.
It works really well. It works much better. It's much nicer. It's great, and I can hear your voice well. It's not that you're too far away from the microphone, so it really works really well, and it kind of breaks it up in a nice way. Much better than to have this kind of Zoom kind of a PowerPoint slide, which I always find quite. Well, because people do it so much, I'm quite always hoping to get away from that. Lene, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. And maybe, outside of this, we can kind of keep in touch anyway.
Let's do that.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hey, Kai. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.